All right, so for our code talk number 3, we're going to combine the last two code talks that we did. So we're going to take our buttons and our button functionality and combine that with now what we know about dialogue and put the two together. Because one thing that I've been noticing as I've been walking around looking at some code, I'm seeing some interesting decisions with the buttons. Some people have been, for just as one example, some people have been, creating a button, and then what they'll do is they'll hide that button after it was clicked, and then they'll have that button do some code for that scene, and then they make new buttons for the next scene. And then when that button is pressed, they do something else, and then those get hidden. So, for 3 different decisions, you might end up with branching with all the branches, you might end up with like 20, 30, 40 different buttons. That's a bit of a waste. It's incredibly hard to maintain code. So what I have here is 2 buttons, and these 2 buttons do everything that my program needs to do for my create a story assignment, right? And how am I doing that? Well, let's take a look over to, oops, did not mean to switch to that. There we go. So let's take a look over to the left side. I've got button 1, click count, and button 2, click count. So I went and I created 2 variables. And these are just going to go up every time I click one of those 2 buttons. So here I'm on button 1, and you'll notice at the very beginning of my program, I'm setting button 1 click count to 0. And then we have my code functionality that we talked about before. And then right here, which is when the button is pressed, what's happening? Well, we're increasing the button 1 click count variable by 1. And then we're broadcasting a message. We're using the broadcast block to broadcast that button 1 was clicked. All right, so let's go over to our 2 characters to see what's happening. I know this looks like a lot of code, but it's all basically repeated stuff, right? So if button 1 is pressed, all we're doing here is checking. If button 1 click count is at 1 and button 2 click count is at 0, well, what happened, right? We pressed the first button and we had never pressed the second button yet, right? So that just means that the game started and we were met with our first choice, and I pressed button 1. Pretty simple. Then I have my dialogue code here, right? We've seen this before. And I just have some speech right there, which right now just says you clicked button 1. I don't have a story or anything, but it's just to sort of get the idea across of what's happening. So instead of going through all this other code, let's just run this once to see what this looks like. Of course, I would hide these variables, but I want you to see the button 1 click count and button 2 click count and see how they work. I'm going to press the green flag. These both got set to 0. And decision 1 comes up and I can click 1 or 2. Well, if I press 1, Scratch says you clicked button 1, dot says you did not click button 2. All right, so that dialog comes up. If I reset this program and I click 2, dot says you clicked button 2, and Scratch says you did not click button 1. Okay, pretty simple. And then I have enough code to do the second decision as well. I didn't go all the way down to the third decision, but I click button 1. I click button 1 again, and Scratch says you clicked button 1 twice. Dot says you never clicked button 2. Right? Of course, the same thing happens if I click button 2 twice, but I want to just show that clicking 1 first, you clicked button 1, did not click button 2, and then clicking button 2, you clicked button 1, then 2, you clicked button 1, then 2. They both say the same thing. And that would be different if I had clicked the 2 and then 1. But I'm not going to show that. I don't want to make this video that long. Okay, so as you can see, each time that a button is pressed, we're just checking what those variables have been set to. So here on the button 1 clicked, I have all of the options where button 1 could have been clicked, right? So I have button 1 was clicked once and button 2 was never clicked. Button 2 was clicked once. Button 1 was clicked twice, sorry, and button 2 was never clicked. Button 1 was clicked once, button 2 was clicked. All right? And then the same over here, but the opposite. 2 was clicked, 1 was never clicked. 2 was clicked twice, 1 was never clicked. 1 and 2 were both clicked. Okay? Very good. Now, this will work just fine with everything that you've learned so far. All I did was add a variable in here. Oh, my code is still running. Let me stop that. There we go. All we did was add the variable for each button. Button 1 click count and button 2 click count. And we ticked it up by 1. And then made this check if it was happening. Notice that there's no need for a forever loop because it's just going to go through and say if, and when it runs out to the bottom, it doesn't need to loop again. Because if it runs out to the bottom and never saw anything, then that just means that we never ran into that scenario, right? There is one bug in this that I'm not going to mention in this video because I don't want it to be too long. But I also kind of want you to see if it's something that you could figure out. And if not, well, I'll have another code talk about it in a little bit. So I'm going to go back to my tree here. I'm going to pull up this little chart, right? So what this chart is just saying, the first column, right, where you see the 3 digits, that's just what the player could have pressed. So 1, 1, 1, this 3 right here, this decision, this scenario, this scene would show up if they had pressed 1, 1, 1, right? And that in our code, in our click counter, would have button 1 clicked 3 times, button 2 clicked never. And notice that that is unique. This is a unique value. That never shows up again. 3, 0. Likewise, we have if we had pressed button 2 3 times, right? Button 2, button 2, button 2. That gets us to this bubble labeled 0, 2, 2, 2. That's 0, 3. Button 1 was never clicked. Button 2 was clicked 3 times. That's unique across everything, right? But look, we have a couple of repeated things. 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1 happens 3 times. And 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2 happens 3 times. So how do you think when we get to our third decision, we're going to be able to differentiate between those two in our code? One hint I can give you is the order in which you place your if statements are going to matter when you get to that point. All right, so think about that. What order could you put them in so that these come out acting the same way? One other little hint I'm going to give you as well. Let me zoom in a bit here. Even though we have 3 things that are the same, it's a little bit less than that actually, right? What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look. Even though we have a 2, 1, a 2, 1, and a 2, 1, which I'll label in red. And then we've got 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2 here that'll label in blue. We're actually have some differences because remember that in terms of our code, it matters also which button we pressed when we get into that last scenario, right? What do I mean by that? Well, notice that we have a 2, 1, and the last button that we pressed was 2. Does that ever show up again? 2, 1, where the last button we pressed was 2? Well, this 2, 1, the last button we pressed was 1. This 2, 1, the last button we pressed was 1. So no. So this one is actually kind of unique because it's going to go under the if button 2 clicked. Let me hold on. Let me say that a little more clear. There we go. The when I receive button 2 clicked. It's going to go under that code, right? But it won't come up in any of these other ones. So in that case, this one's kind of unique because button 2 was pressed last and we got a button 1. And we'll notice that there's the same thing, but in reverse with a 1, 2. We should have a 1, 2 here where the last button that we pressed was the first button. So these two are actually slightly unique as well. So which are the ones that repeat, right? I'll label those in blue. The ones that repeat are a 2, 1, where the last button pressed was 1, because we also have that here. And then I'll put in, I guess I'll put in pink here, a 1, 2, where the last button pressed was 2. So these are really the only two we have to think about, because button 1 clicked will equal 1, and button 2 clicked will equal 2. In the when I received button 2 clicked twice. So like I said, the one thing that can help you out with this is the order that you put your if statements. And I want you to think about that. So I'll leave you on that thought. This code might be a little too big for a screenshot on Canvas, but we'll find some way to put it on there for you. So thank you for watching another Code Talk. We'll see you next time.